On December 16, 1944, when the German offensive in the Ardennes began, American forces holding the St. Vith sector had a life expectancy measured in hours. Two divisions, the 106th Infantry Division and the 7th Armored Division, were shattered in the first 18 hours of the assault. Command structures disintegrated. Communication lines were cut. Approximately 15,000 American soldiers were scattered across a 12-kilometer front, with no unified leadership, no coherent defensive plan, and no idea which units still existed.
German operational planning, based on intelligence assessments conducted by the 6th Panzer Army staff, allocated 72 hours to break through St. Vith and secure the road junction.
72 hours from initial assault to complete capture. After that, German armored spearheads would have unrestricted access to the road network leading to the Meuse River crossings, the final objective before Antwerp. The timeline was aggressive but achievable. St. Vith was not a fortress. It was a town defended by disorganized remnants of broken units. German commanders expected token resistance followed by rapid collapse. St. Vith fell on December 23rd, 6 days after the German timeline said it would. That 6-day delay did not just slow the offensive, it collapsed the entire operational plan. German armored divisions stacked up behind St. Vith, unable to advance, burning fuel they could not replace, while American reinforcements flooded into defensive positions further west. By the time German forces finally took the town, the window for reaching the Meuse had closed. The offensive was already lost. The man responsible for holding St. Vith those 6 days was a 31-year-old engineer captain named Robert Hasbrouck. Not a general, not a combat arms officer, not anyone authorized by rank, training, or doctrine to command a multi-divisional defensive sector. An engineer captain who took control of 15,000 soldiers, organized them into a functional defensive force, and held ground that 2-star generals had already written off as lost. And the U.S. Army never officially recognized what he did. Here's how the catastrophe at St. Vith unfolded. The 106th Infantry Division, newly arrived in Europe with no combat experience, was holding a 20-mile front in the Ardennes when 3 German armies hit them at dawn on December 16th. The division's position collapsed within hours. 2 entire regiments, the 422nd and 423rd, were surrounded and captured. The 3rd Regiment fragmented into isolated pockets. Division command ceased to exist as a functional entity. The 7th Armored Division was rushed forward to reinforce, but by the time they arrived, there was no front line to reinforce, no command post to report to, no orders to follow. What remained was chaos. Artillery units without infantry support, tank destroyers without targeting information, infantry companies that had lost contact with their own battalions, logistics troops who had become frontline soldiers because the front line had moved behind them. Nobody knew who was in command. Nobody knew what the plan was. Officers were issuing contradictory orders based on outdated information. Units were retreating, advancing, and holding simultaneously because no one had the authority to coordinate movement. Into this situation walked Robert Hasbrouck, executive officer of the 168th Engineer Combat Battalion, arriving in St. Vith on the night of December 17th, with orders to assess defensive preparations. What he found was a headquarters town filling with stragglers, walking wounded, and leaderless units streaming west in no particular order. The senior officer present was a colonel from a shattered artillery battalion who was preparing to evacuate the town because he assumed St. Vith was already lost. Hasbrouck looked at the map, looked at the troop strength counts, looked at the road junction St. Vith controlled, and made a decision that had no legal basis in military authority. He assumed command of every unit in the sector and began organizing a defense. He had no authorization to do this. Engineer captains do not command divisions. They do not issue orders to infantry colonels, artillery majors, or armored battalion commanders. The chain of command is absolute, and violating it, especially during combat operations, is grounds for court-martial. Hasbrouck knew this. He also knew that if someone did not take control immediately, 15,000 American soldiers were going to die or be captured, and German panzers were going to be in Liège by Christmas. So he did it anyway. The first thing Hasbrouck built was a headquarters that did not exist.
He commandeered a basement in the St. Vith town hall, installed field telephones, set up map boards, and declared it the St. Vith Sector Command Post. There was no such command in the organizational structure of any American unit. He invented it. Then he sent messengers, engineers from his own battalion, to every unit within 10 kilometers, with orders to report to the new command post with strength assessments and current positions. The orders came from a captain. Infantry colonels could have ignored them. Tank commanders could have laughed. But the orders were specific, written, and addressed command problems that everyone recognized were getting men killed. Officers started showing up, not because Hasbrouck had authority, but because someone was finally acting like they had authority. And in the absence of actual leadership, invented leadership was better than nothing. Within 24 hours, Hasbrouck had assembled a staff of 37 officers from 11 different units, none of whom had worked together before. He organized them into intelligence, operations, and logistics sections, a miniature division staff built from scrap. Then, he did something no engineer officer was trained to do. He designed a defensive perimeter. St. Vith sat in a natural bowl surrounded by ridges. Hasbrouck positioned infantry on the ridges with interlocking fields of fire. He placed tank destroyers at road junctions where German armor would have to slow down. He dug artillery into positions where they could cover multiple approaches. He established supply routes, casualty collection points, and ammunition distribution nodes. He built a defense in depth that military textbooks said required weeks of planning and engineer support. He did it in 36 hours using units that did not know each other's names, let alone their radio frequencies. The defense was not elegant. It was improvised, undermanned, and held together by messengers on foot because radio communication was still sporadic. But it was a defense, which was more than German intelligence expected to encounter. When the first German probe hit the St. Vith perimeter on December 19th, the day German planning said the town would already be in their hands, they ran into coordinated resistance. Artillery fell on their approach routes. Tank destroyers engaged from pre-sighted positions. Infantry held ground instead of melting away. The probe was repulsed. The Germans tried again on December 20th with a full armored assault. 2 panzer battalions supported by infantry, hitting the northern perimeter where intelligence said American defenses were weakest. Hasbrouck had anticipated the avenue of approach. He had positioned the 7th Armored Division's remaining Shermans in hull-down positions along the ridge, supported by every anti-tank gun he could scrounge. The panzers advanced into a kill zone. They lost 17 tanks in 40 minutes and withdrew. For 6 days, this pattern repeated. German forces probed, assaulted, tried to flank, and tried to break through with overwhelming force. And for 6 days, the improvised defense at St. Vith held. Not because American forces were stronger, German forces outnumbered the defenders by more than 2 to 1, but because someone had organized the defense, coordinated the units, and made decisions fast enough to respond to German movements. That someone was a captain who, according to military regulations, had no business commanding anyone above company level. By December 22nd, St. Vith was surrounded on 3 sides. Supply lines were cut. Ammunition was running low. Casualties had reduced combat strength by nearly 40%. Hasbrouck sent a message to 8 Corps headquarters requesting permission to withdraw. The reply came from Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, who had assumed command of American forces in the northern Ardennes sector. Hold at all costs. Hasbrouck held for 1 more day. On the night of December 23rd, with German forces finally breaking through the eastern perimeter, he organized a fighting withdrawal. Every unit, every vehicle, every wounded man extracted in sequence under covering fire. The withdrawal took 11 hours and succeeded because Hasbrouck had prepared the evacuation plan 3 days earlier, knowing that hold at all costs eventually ends in withdraw or die. St. Vith fell on December 23rd. 6 days after German operational plans said it would. Those 6 days destroyed the German offensive timeline beyond recovery. The 5th Panzer Army, scheduled to be across the Meuse by December 22nd, was still stacked up east of St. Vith on December 23rd. Fuel reserves, calculated for a rapid advance, were exhausted in stationary fighting. American reinforcements, which German planning assumed would arrive too late, were already entrenched in defensive positions west of the Meuse. The window had closed. Post-war analysis by both American and German military historians identified the delay at St. Vith as the single most consequential operational outcome of the Battle of the Bulge's first week.
If St. Vith had fallen on schedule, German armor would have reached the Meuse before American reinforcements established a coherent defense line. If the Meuse crossings had been taken, the operational situation would have shifted from German offensive defeated to potential strategic breakthrough requiring emergency redeployment of Allied forces from other fronts. St. Vith didn't fall on schedule because one unauthorized captain organized a defense that wasn't supposed to exist. The United States Army's official after-action report on the St. Vith defense, published in 1945, credited decisive leadership by senior commanders in organizing scattered forces into effective resistance. It mentioned multiple colonels and generals by name. It did not mention Captain Robert Hasbrock. His assumption of unauthorized command was noted in several unit reports, but never highlighted in official summaries, because acknowledging that a captain had effectively commanded a division-level defense would require explaining why actual division-level commanders had failed to do so. Hasbrook was awarded the Silver Star for gallantry in action. The citation mentioned his work preparing defensive positions. It did not mention that he had assumed command of 15,000 soldiers without authorization, built a headquarters from nothing, designed and executed a 6-day defensive operation that altered the outcome of the war's largest battle, and did all of this while facing the possibility of court-martial if he survived. After the war, Hasbrook returned to civilian life, worked as a structural engineer in Ohio, and rarely discussed his role at St. Vith. Military historians conducting research in the 1970s tracked him down through unit records and interviewed him about the improvised defense. He described the decisions he made, the command structure he created, and the officers who trusted an unauthorized captain because the alternative was chaos. When asked if he worried about facing charges for assuming command illegally, he said he was too busy trying not to die to worry about regulations. Robert Hasbrook died in 1989. His obituary in the Cleveland Plain Dealer mentioned his service in World War II, but did not mention St. Vith. Most historians who study the Battle of the Bulge in detail know what he did. The general public does not. The United States Army has never formally revised its official history to acknowledge that the defense of St. Vith was organized and commanded by an engineer captain acting without authority.
Here is what the story of St. Vith reveals about the relationship between authority and effectiveness. Military hierarchies exist because coordinated action at scale requires clear chains of command. Unauthorized assumption of command is prohibited because it creates the potential for conflicting orders, wasted resources, and organizational chaos. These are legitimate concerns. Hierarchies serve real functions. But hierarchies are designed for stable operations, not catastrophic breakdowns. When the system collapses, when divisions disintegrate, communication fails, and senior leadership is absent or paralyzed, the choice is not between authorized command and unauthorized command.
The choice is between unauthorized command and no command at all. Robert Hasbrook violated regulations because following regulations meant watching 15,000 men die.
He took a risk that could have destroyed his career because not taking the risk would have destroyed something more important than careers. That is not recklessness. That is moral clarity about what matters when doctrine and reality conflict.
The deeper institutional failure is what happened afterward. The U.S. Army had an officer who demonstrated extraordinary capability under conditions where authorized leaders had failed.
He improvised a command structure, designed a defense, coordinated disparate units, held ground against superior forces, and executed a successful withdrawal under fire. Every one of those actions represented skills the Army desperately needed in its officer corps. The logical institutional response would have been to study what Hasbrook did, extract the lessons, train other officers in the methods he developed under pressure, and promote him to positions where those skills could be applied at a larger scale. Instead, the Army buried his role in official histories because acknowledging it would require admitting that the institutional command structure had failed when it mattered most.
The lesson is not that hierarchies are bad or that officers should routinely ignore the chain of command. The lesson is that institutions must distinguish between authority that serves coordination and authority that serves only itself. When the system is working, following the chain of command enables effectiveness. When the system has collapsed, following the chain of command becomes a suicide pact. The difference between those two situations is not always clear in the moment, but the officers who can recognize the difference and act accordingly are the ones who save lives when doctrine fails.
Here is the question this story leaves unresolved. How many catastrophes have been made worse because capable people waited for authorization that never came?
How many disasters could have been contained if someone had been willing to assume command without permission, organize a response without waiting for the official chain to reconstitute, and face the consequences later?
The institutional incentive is always to wait for proper authority, because unauthorized action carries personal risk. But the human cost of waiting is measured in lives that could have been saved if someone had been willing to act.
At St. Vith, the cost of waiting would have been 15,000 American prisoners, a German breakthrough to the Meuse, and a battle of the Bulge that lasted months instead of weeks.
The cost of acting without permission was one captain's career risk. That's not a balanced equation.
The cost of acting without permission was one captain's career risk. That's not a balanced equation. Robert Hasbrouck understood this. The United States Army never formally acknowledged that he was right.
Here is my question for you. When institutions fail at the moment they are needed most, what justifies waiting for proper authority before acting?
Is there any situation where preserving the chain of command matters more than preventing a preventable catastrophe?
Is there any situation where preserving the chain of command matters more than preventing a preventable catastrophe? And when someone steps outside the system to solve a problem the system could not solve, what does it say about the institution if they bury that person's contribution instead of learning from it?
Drop your thoughts in the comments. If this changed how you see the relationship between institutional authority and battlefield necessity, hit that like button and subscribe for more history that reveals what happens when one person's unauthorized decision changes the outcome of a war. Thanks for watching.